So do you know it's been 17 years since I preached from this pulpit? I'm feeling the age, let me tell you. But is it ever delightful to be among you this day? So as Mark mentioned, we're going to take a little bit of a dive into Jubilee. The year of Jubilee in Leviticus chapter 25 is one of the most radical principles in the Bible. Every 50 years, every Israelite was supposed to return to their original piece of land. For most people, remember, this would be a once-in-a-lifetime occurrence. In this year, not only would the land lie fallow, debts that had accumulated between owner and servant and slave would be forgiven. As families were reunited, Sabbath rest. Can you imagine? Hannah talked about rest last week. We would have a year of rest, a year-long nap. Wouldn't that be amazing? This Sabbath rest was granted not only so that the precious land could be restored, but in order to allow each part of humanity to celebrate the covenant relationship between themselves, their neighbors, their land, and their God. The Jubilee would have effectively prevented cycles of intergenerational poverty. I just want you to think about that for a moment. Intergenerational poverty would not exist in the way we know it. The Jubilee had the potential to create a social and an economic parity that would have made Israel unique among nations. If we fast forward to Jesus' ministry, we see that the notion of Jubilee was still very much part of the Hebrew culture. Jesus announced that he was enacting the year of Jubilee when he launched his public ministry. In the Gospel of Luke, one of my very favorite passages, Jesus harkens back to this radical notion of Jubilee when he stands up in the temple in his hometown of Nazareth. He unrolls the scroll from the prophet Isaiah, and he reads, "The Spirit of God is upon me, because God has anointed me to bring good news to the afflicted. God has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim the year of God's favor, the year of Jubilee." When Jesus closes with the words, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing," in essence, he is saying, the year of Jubilee is now. The practice of Jubilee must be central to how we live God's radical message of love and right relationship, not just once every 50 years, but as an ongoing principle to guide our lives. There is so much within the concept of Jubilee to begin to wrap our heads around. So if you want some homework after our time together this morning, a good starting place might be via Walter Brueggemann, renowned scholar and theologian. He has written a paper that I found really fascinating entitled "Emancipating Debt, Biblical Jubilee and Contemporary Economics." And it actually is great bedtime reading. That is, if the time change doesn't do you in before you hit the pillow tonight. So in order for us to begin to grasp this concept of Jubilee, I want to share a few principles that Brueggemann offers as a backdrop to our time this morning. If we had continued reading our passage through to verse 42, we would have heard these words. "For they are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves are sold." And Brueggemann goes on to say this verse occurs near the end of a long chapter of regulations concerning the land and the economy. In every part of the regulations, provision is made to protect the well-being of the land and a neighborly economy from unrestrained predation or predators. And B, care is taken to enact and assure the intent of Yahweh for the land and the people who belong to Yahweh. In that specific part of the verse, special protection is offered for those who have been impoverished and have gone into debt. It is allowed that the ones indebted may be bound to their creditors, but only for a time, not forever, until the Jubilee year. Thus, the bondage of debt had clear and precise and non-negotiable limitations. Can you imagine? In order to prevent the formation of a permanent debtor class. So in summary, Jubilee is immediately contemporary for us because our economy, not unlike the time of Leviticus, readily preys upon those who remain hopelessly and forever in debt. Which brings us to Monopoly. And if you want the fuller story of how this game really came into being, Joan Mason will conduct a tutorial after our time together, because the way that Monopoly stands in this version is not the way it was intended. How many of us grew up with this game? How many of us still like to play this game? Okay. Had the hands go down a bit. One of the highlights when I first moved away from my childhood home